Hello and welcome back to AP Psychology. I'm Miss Lee, and in this video we are finishing up Unit 5, Cognitive Psychology. This video will be about assessing intelligence. Our learning targets for this video will be to identify the contributions of key researchers in intelligence research and testing, including Alfred Binet, Francis Galton, Lewis Terman, and David Wechsler. We will explain how psychologists design tests, including standardization strategies and other techniques to establish reliability and validity. We will interpret the meaning of scores in terms of the normal curve, and we will describe relevant labels related to intelligence testing, both gifted and intellectual disability. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and grab your notes and let's get started. So when we talk about assessing intelligence, it's interesting to think about why we do that. Psychologists define intelligence testing as a method for assessing an individual's mental aptitudes as well as comparing them with others using numerical scores. So what would be the purpose of comparing these results with other people and other scores? Why would we do that? So let's talk about Alfred Binet. Alfred Binet and his colleague Theodore Simon developed the first standardized intelligence test. They were commissioned by the French government to design a test to identify French children who would have problems in regular classes. They were looking through their data for children who might have difficulty in a regular classroom. His impact is immeasurable. First of all, he set out to find a child's mental age, or the average age of individuals who achieve a particular level of performance. He did not create the test to label children. He actually warned that if the information were misused, it would do just this. Instead, he wanted only to find a way to help improve the educational experience of French children. Lewis Terman, who was an American psychologist, adapted and revised Binet's test for American school children and named the test the Stanford Binet IQ test. He worked at Stanford, and so that's why it's called the Stanford Binet. There is a form of the Stanford Binet that is still in use today. And today the Stanford Binet is given orally and varies in nature according to the person taking the test. For children, they are given figures to copy or everyday problems to solve. Adults, however, are asked to solve analogies, explain proverbs, and describe similarities that underlie sets of words. The examiner begins by finding a mental age at which the person can answer all the questions. Then they move on to more difficult problems. When the mental age is reached, it's where no problems can be answered and the test is over. William Stern was the first person who introduced the formula of intelligence quotient, or IQ. How we used to formulate IQ was that we took the mental age and divided it by the chronological age, then multiplied that by 100. So theoretically, if your mental age was exactly the same as your chronological age, that would mean that you have an IQ of 100. It is important to know that IQ is no longer computed this way. Then we come to David Wechsler. Wechsler developed the WAIS, or the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And later on, he developed the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, or the WISC. The WISC is an intelligence test for preschoolers. The Wechsler tests are the most widely used IQ test today. The WAIS measures overall intelligence, and it consists of two parts, verbal and performance. The verbal part of the test is really focused on vocabulary definitions and comprehension, and the performance part of the test is a timed assembly of small objects and arranged pictures in logical order. Normally, verbal and performance are within a close range, but separate scores can give a more precise picture of the person's specific abilities. So you can perform higher in one area than the other, but they do tend to be pretty close to one another. There are two basic types of tests. You have achievement tests and aptitude tests. Achievement tests are intended to reflect what you've already learned. It's your current level of knowledge about that topic. Aptitude tests are intended to predict your ability to learn a new skill, basically how well you could do. So what are some examples of that? You have the ACT, you have the SAT. Achievement tests are more like a unit exam or the AP psychology test that you'll be taking in May. So how are tests constructed? For a psychological test to be acceptable, it must fulfill three criteria. It has to go through a process of standardization. It must be reliable, and it must be valid. So let's talk about standardization first. In a standardized test, the test items have been piloted on similar populations of people and norms have been established. Norms are developed by calculating the average score achieved by that particular group, and then each person's score can be compared to see how it differs from people who've taken the test in the past. For example, the AP exam that you're going to take in May was given to a sample of freshmen in college within the last few years to normalize the test or to find the norms. This group that's given the test to find the norms is called the standardization sample. And the average from this group is what the scores test will be compared to. This is one of the norms that will be used to come up with your final exam score. To continue with this idea of standardization, periodically tests are re-standardized. They're given to a random representative sample to reset and check the established norms to make sure that they are still something that is meaningful. And this includes intelligence tests whose normal score is 100. That's why when we talk about the Flynn effect, we still maintain a norm of a 100 on most IQ tests. And here's something to ponder. Let's say I took the AP psychology exam back in 2005 and got a 4. Let's say you get a 4 on this year's test. What does the Flynn effect say about the difference in our scores? If I took the test back in 2005, theoretically, you should be scoring higher. So why then are both scores a 4? Well, because the test is periodically re-normed. So that test score will theoretically still reflect that particular year's cadre of exam takers. We've talked about the normal curve before, so let's review. Standardized tests do establish a normal distribution of scores on a tested population. A bell-shaped pattern is called the normal curve. So if you look at the chart, some numbers to remember. 100 is considered to be a normal average IQ. At 70, which is below that, it is 2 standard deviations below that, in fact, people are considered to be intellectually disabled. On the other end of the spectrum, if you go up 2 standard deviations, up to 130, then that person is considered to be intellectually gifted. Francis Galton argued that intelligence is quantifiable and normally distributed, and he believed we could assign a score for intelligence, which then determines who will fall below the average range and who will fall above it. Let's talk about reliability. A test is reliable when it yields consistent results. In order to establish reliability, researchers establish different procedures. You've got a split half reliability. What the researcher will do is divide the test into 2 equal halves and assess how consistent the scores are. You also have reliability using different tests. So you use different forms of the same test to measure consistency between them. And finally, you have test-retest reliability. You use the same test on 2 different occasions to measure consistency. Now, you would want to be careful that you don't have it taken so many times that a testing effect would inflate the score at the end of the day. You don't want that to happen, but you also wouldn't want to re-administer the test so close to the first administration, which could potentially also inflate the results because the person has just taken that test. So you have to be really careful with test-retest reliability. Basically, you know a tape measure is reliable because every time you measure your height, it shows you as the same height. It is going to yield consistent results. However, reliability of a test does not ensure validity. Validity refers to what the test is supposed to actually measure or predict. You have content validity, which is referring to the extent a test measures a particular behavior or trait. So it is measuring the thing that it's supposed to measure. You also have predictive validity. This is referring to the function of a test in predicting a particular behavior or trait. It really depends on the test. The test can be reliable but not valid. It can consistently yield results that don't really measure what it's supposed to measure. When you want to measure your weight, you don't use a ruler. Why? Because that would not be a valid assessment of your weight. It would be, however, consistent, which means it would be reliable, just reliably not measuring what you want it to measure. A testing example would be a second grader is taking a math test. All of the problems are word problems with higher vocabulary, and he struggles to show that he really knows math because of it. Is that test measuring only his math? No, it's not a valid measurement of math skills due to high-level vocabulary. So we finally get to extremes of intelligence. A valid intelligence test is going to divide 2 groups of people into 2 extremes. The intellectually disabled are going to roughly have an IQ of 70 or below, and the intellectually gifted are going to have an IQ of 130 or above, and they are significantly different. To have an intellectual disability means to have significantly below average intellectual functioning and limitations in at least two areas of adaptive functioning. So you're talking about communication skills, self-care, the ability to live independently, social skills, community involvement, self-direction, health and safety, academics, and leisure and work. When it comes to intellectual disability, there can be a lot of different causes. Here are some of the more common ones. You've got genetics, which can lead to a condition like Down syndrome. You have the environmental effects. An example of that could be fetal alcohol syndrome. There could be deprivation or neglect at an early age. And then you have cases where there really isn't an apparent or known cause. There is no cure for intellectual disability, but some preventive measures can be taken for certain causes of intellectual disability. And a highly stimulated environment can also help move that person in a more progressive direction. Some of those measures can include a test that's performed on newborns for hidden genetic disorder called PKU. If detected early enough, the intellectual disability associated with PKU can be prevented by a special diet. More generally, genetic counseling, pregnancy care services, and education for new parents are other preventive strategies. There are different levels of intellectual disability. A person with a mild intellectual disability, and this includes 85% of all intellectual disabilities, their academic abilities are about at the 6th grade level. They tend to be able to learn how to live on their own and hold a job. A moderate intellectual disability, you're looking at someone whose academic abilities are approximately that of a 2nd grader. They can be trained in self-care and acquire some reading and writing skills, but they will still need some supervision. Then you have folks with a severe intellectual disability. This is someone whose mental capacity is about that of a 5-year-old. So this is someone who can learn to talk and in most cases perform simple tasks, but they're going to need close supervision. And then you have someone with profound intellectual disability. Their mental age is less than 3. They typically have very limited communication and require constant supervision. Having numerous physical disabilities is very common. Intellectually gifted people have IQ scores above 130. The most extensive research on giftedness was done by Terman. The set of his resulting data has led to much of what we know about the subject. Basically, he studied 1,528 students near the top of the IQ range in adulthood, and he found that gifted children excelled in school, had overall good health, and were generally happy. Interestingly enough, newer research suggests that highly gifted children may be susceptible to certain physical or psychological disorders. What Terman found ultimately is that most people who had an intellectual giftedness continue on a path of success, but they don't typically live these extraordinary lives. Typically, they lead very ordinary, undistinguished lives. And that is it for assessing intelligence. In our next video, we will be starting a brand new unit, developmental psychology. I can't wait to see you then. Bye for now.